Hey there, Ian from smallisnewbig.com.au, and in previous videos I talked about APRA and how APRA changes 3 or 4 years ago affected the properties in a negative way. They actually pushed prices in an upward direction because they put sophisticated market investors out of the marketplace and put unsophisticated investors into the marketplace to push the property prices up. Then I talked about Sydney and Melbourne and how the cycle has changed and we've got a downward move in the housing prices in that area. And then we talked about how some people are comparing America and Australia right now. So America GFC and Australia at the moment, low taxes, low interest rates, we've got some unemployment rates that are increasing a little bit, and we've got a number of different marketplaces that are looking similar to the GFC. But I explained in those videos that I don't believe that America could act the same as Australia because America has different rules around mortgages. As an example, you can just walk away from your mortgage, hand it back, have a bad credit rating for 2 or 3 years and then go out and get another mortgage in 2 or 3 years' time. In Australia, you can't do that. You are basically tied up for 10 to 12 years in Australia if you ever want to get a mortgage, if you default and hand back or go bankrupt. Now, in this video, I want to talk about interest rates. Interest rates have dropped. They've dropped 2 times in 2 months in recent times. Now the property market in Sydney and Melbourne particularly went stalwart or downhill just before the election. Now if you look historically at every election that's ever happened in Australia, that's a federal election, the property prices have basically stood still. Why? Because there's a number of different aspects around different policies that each side is announcing and no one really knows what's going to happen. In this most recent election, they were talking about getting rid of negative gearing from the Labor side. So of course, that's basically stopped the market dead. Why would you go and invest in a property when you weren't sure what's going to do? Now, what the crazy thing about that is that negative gearing is the worst strategy you could possibly do on your properties. If you are not making money out of your property every day or every week or every month or every year, you have bought the wrong property. This is why we talk about a strategy that makes sure that you've got positive cash flow coming in on properties every day, every week, every month, every year, because in that way, it doesn't matter whether property prices go upwards, downwards or sideways, you're still protected. Now the interest rate drops are going to stimulate the marketplace, and since the election has happened, we have had a recovery, according to the media, which I don't really read much of, but I do get to see stuff on Facebook and social media. But I don't think that that recovery that's happened has anything to do with anything around interest rates. It will affect in the long term, and when I talk long term right now, I'm talking probably 6 months. You will see obviously the apparent ability for you to be able to go and get loans. APRA's dropped their ceiling rate, so you can get more loans now, and it means that you'll be able to go out and invest in more property. But I really don't think, with what's happened in Sydney and Melbourne, and it's scared the whole marketplace, that there's going to be this massive boom in the property prices, especially when you know that cycles in property happen every 16 years. Now, when you look at those 16 years, you're going to have an up, you're going to have a flat, you're going to have a down, and you're going to have another flat at the down before the recovery happens. And so Sydney and Melbourne are clearly somewhere between 3 to 6 o'clock right now, and maybe even 2 o'clock if you looked at it, because it's only been recently they've gone down in marketplaces. So that's where you should be going off and looking at the great strategies of what you could do in other parts of the country. So for me, Brisbane, is there a possibility that that's going to go up in price? Absolutely. It didn't do the stimulus that Sydney and Melbourne did, and of course people have sold out of Sydney and Melbourne and are now starting to look at cheaper options to be able to buy their own homes. So that will stimulate the Brisbane market. Now, what stopped the Brisbane market from being stimulated too early was an oversupply of units. Now, those oversupply of units, they've stopped basically building, and those oversupply of units will be taking up within 1 to 2 years. And that's when you'll see a move in the Brisbane marketplace. When it comes to Perth, well, Perth, you're buying properties at the same price that you could buy a property in 2008. And I ask you to go out and be very strategic with what you do, because in Perth there is a whole bunch of smaller properties that have approvals for subdivisions or townhouses that are sitting there DA approved, waiting to go, and you can buy them reasonably cheap. Now, the people that bought those properties 5, 6, 10 years ago are sitting on them going, I just need to get rid of them, they're hurting me, I'm negative cash flow and I want to get out. It's a great strategy for you to get into. Now, Darwin. Darwin again also had an oversupply of units, and that did affect the marketplace there. But Darwin has always had stimulus in short bursts. So if you pick your marketplace right in Darwin, then you're right to go. South Australia, I don't think that South Australia has ever had a bad year. Now, I do say that tongue in cheek because South Australia is a very conservative, slow as you go, and has a slow increase in prices, and it doesn't have the ups and downs that other metropolitan cities in Australia have. It has a good gradual growth, and in South Australia, again, with all of these states that I'm mentioning, we've got amazing strategies that you can get great positive cash flow. As an example, in South Australia, we had a client that bought a property for $300,000, spent about $50,000 on it, and instead of renting it for $350 a week, is getting over $1,000 a week. This is something that you could be doing as well. Now, we talk about the ACT and the Northern Territory, and I talked about Darwin, but talk about the ACT. Now, ACT is a really interesting place. Again, like South Australia, it has a standardised increase in the property prices. Why? Because the whole ACT is run by one government or one council, and they get to release land whenever they feel the need to. So you won't get the peaks and troughs of what you see in Sydney and Melbourne, because when there is a need for housing, what the ACT government does is they just release more housing to allow people to be able to get in and afford to get in there. However, the ACT has a huge housing shortage right now. Why? Because when every sitting week happens in Canberra, we have an influx of up to 10,000 people. That's 10,000 every time that a politician walks into the Parliament House, or the whole bunch of politicians walked in there. We have an increase in population of 10,000, from consultants to advisors and everyone that surrounds the political fraternity. Now, there is a need for shorter term accommodation. We're talking, 3-month and 6-month and 12-month accommodation for people just like those 10,000, plus other people that just want to afford to be able to live somewhere and save some money as well. Now, Tasmania has had a reasonably good 2 years. You've had somewhere between 15 to 25% growth over 18 months to 2 years, and people are continuing to go down there and buy. Remember that if you're buying at the peak of the market, you're actually making a mistake. When we talk about hotspots, if you read and you buy different publications that have hotspots and the next hotspot, you've got to be wary of the fact that if it is already a hotspot, you shouldn't be going there. Now, I know that there's parts of Tasmania and it operates as a two-speed economy. We've got Hobart, it operates on its own little cycle that goes on, and then we've got northern Tasmania, which has its own economy that works as well. So when you talk about Launceston and Devonport and a couple of those different areas, Burnie up there, they operate differently. Now, if you want to know a key indicator of what Tasmania will do, I've got a basic rule of thumb. The Sydney median house price, when Sydney peaks, expect that Hobart will go to 50% of the median. So as an example, if the median hits $1 million in Sydney, expect that the house prices in Hobart will hit $500,000. Now, when Sydney was at probably 1.1 median house price, the peak of the market, we had Tasmania sitting at about $280,000 to $320,000 as a median price in Hobart. So it had to move. My other rule of thumb is, when you look at Melbourne, if you look at the median house price in Melbourne at its peak, the north of Tasmania will also hit 50% of the Melbourne peak. So again, Melbourne peaked at about $860,000, $920,000 when it came to the median house price. So the north and northwest of Tasmania was at about 250, 240, and so you knew that there was going to be a move to about a 400 plus marketplace. Now, there is some opportunity still in the north, but I'd be very careful and choosy about what you're doing. But remember that the difference between a good buy and a bad buy is about 3 or 4 years. Now, that's a tongue-in-cheek comment as well. But remember also that if you have a really bad purchase and if you've bought a property that has positive cash flow, regardless of the eventuation of time, over 10 years and 20 years, you'll become very wealthy. And in the meantime, you'll be paid to become wealthy because you'll have positive cash flow coming out of your property. So, are interest rates going to affect the property market in Australia? Well, yeah, they're going to affect it. And the whole point of dropping interest rates is to stimulate the marketplace, not just only in housing, but also in the rest of the industry around stocks and around building, and making sure that this great country that we live in continues to do the amazing stuff it does with the low unemployment rate we've got right now. And long live Australia.